When we think about life in the Middle Ages, we tend to conjure up grim and dismal images of war, poverty, sickness, the bubonic plague, and basically everything that will sum up the Dark Ages. The Middle Ages in Europe lasted roughly from the 5th century to the 15th century AD. In some places it declined sooner than others, but in general it began giving away to the Renaissance period and the famed Age of Discovery around the 15th century. How much do we really know about the Middle Ages and about the lives of the medieval people? Today, we're going to go into the depths of medieval society to uncover all the little details that made up the lives of lords to peasants, soldiers to courtiers. But before we get started, don't forget to like and subscribe. In medieval society, there was a clear hierarchy called the feudal system. The king was at the top, followed by the nobility, which included lords and members of the clergy. Below the nobility were knights and then peasants. Freemen were peasants who were allowed to move around and had slightly more rights. Then villeins, who were legally tied to a specific piece of land. As you go down the hierarchy system, the groups of people get larger, meaning that a small number of people, like the king or nobility, had control over a large number of people in the country. The majority of the population lived in the countryside, and some 85% of population could be described as peasants. The main centers of habitation in the Middle Ages were castles. A castle required a lot of work and care. Castles varied in sizes and were almost always the seats of regional lords. Lords held titles and lands and gathered taxes from villages that were on those lands. In return, a lord had to swear his obedience to a king and provide military aid at any given time. Outside the castle, a village usually arose, most often filled with artisans whose skills were needed for proper functioning of the castle. These were millers, bakers, blacksmiths, and butchers, farmers, and cooks. For peasants, daily medieval life revolved around an agrarian calendar, with the majority of time spent working the land and trying to grow enough food to survive another year. Peasants that lived on a manor by the castle were assigned strips of land to plant and harvest. They typically planted rye, oats, peas, and barley, and harvested crops. Each peasant family had its own strip of land. However, the peasants worked cooperatively on tasks such as plowing and haying. They were also expected to build roads, clear forests, as determined by the lord. All these sound like normal and acceptable jobs, and most of them were. But not all castle-related jobs were so pleasing. One of these notoriously unpleasant medieval jobs was that of a gong farmer. Medieval castles often relied on gravity for waste disposal. A castle would have a chamber slightly gutted out from the wall, which is known as the closet or privy, and was what we know as today as a toilet. These cesspits, where excrement would pile up, had to be emptied in due time, and this was the job of a gong farmer. And many gong farmers would end up passing away from the toxic fumes of those excrements. Now coming to housing, the houses of medieval peasants were of poor quality compared to modern houses. The floor was normally earthen, and there were very little ventilation and few sources of light in the forms of windows. In addition to human inhabitants, a number of livestock animals would also reside in the house. But comfort was not always even found in rich houses. Heating was always a problem with stone floors, ceilings, and walls. Furniture consisted of wooden benches, long tables, cupboards, and pantries. Linen, when affordable, would be glued or nailed to benches to provide some comfort. Beds, though made of soft materials, were often full of bedbugs, lice, and other biting insects. Daily life of a nobility, however, included socializing with other nobility, playing games including chess, which echoed the hierarchy of the nobles, and playing music, etc. The lords of the noble class enjoyed much power and riches, and all those below them had few, if any, rights. The daily life of a medieval lord would usually start with going to a church mass followed by breakfast or bread and wine. In the mornings, they would meet with the manager of the manor, whilst the lady would do embroidery. Knights would practice fighting. At lunchtime, food would be eaten in the Great Hall, consisting of lots of small dishes. Jesters and music would entertain. In the afternoon, hunting groups would go off and board games would be played inside. At dusk, they would offer their church prayers and then have dinner. Huge feasts would be put on for guests. In the evenings, stories of the day's events would be heard by a traveling minstrel, idle chit-chat amongst guests, and then at night, people would offer their church prayers once more, then a light meal, followed by bed. As it is clear, class differences were huge, enormous enough, and injustice was rampant. While the peasants had meager diets, the nobility often indulged in all they wanted. Furthermore, the nobles, lords, and kings all vied for more power and more wealth, and to achieve their greedy goals, they relied on the poor peasants that served them. In the Middle Ages, the rich ate well. They ate beef, mutton, pork, and venison. They also ate a great variety of birds, swans, herons, ducks, blackbirds, and pigeons. On special occasions, the rich had huge feasts. The lord and his lady sat at a table on a raised wooden platform so they could look down on the rest of the household. Often musicians entertained them while they ate. Rich people ate their food from slices of stale bread called trenchers. Afterwards, they were given to the poor. Poor people ate a simple and monotonous diet. Peasants usually ate warm porridges made of wheat, oats, and barley. Broth, stews, vegetables, and bread were also part of a peasant's diet. But they rarely ate meat, and when they did, it was their own animals that they saved for winter. Peasants drank wine and ale, rarely water. With poverty came poor living conditions, and with that, a short lifespan. For centuries, the people of medieval Europe would not live past 40 or 50, and old age was a rarity. Children also experienced dreadful fates and high mortality rates. Without contraception, women would give birth to as many as 10, 12, 15, or even 20 children. But perhaps only 2 or 3 of these offspring would survive into adulthood. From this, we can deduce that parents were most likely less moved by these happenings, as it was an expected condition of life. London was notorious for its lack of hygiene and its dismal conditions. A combination of rapid urban growth and lack of suitable space led to overcrowding and the spread of sickness. Many contemporary sources go into detail about the conditions of life in such a city. Rats ran in plain sight, stray dogs were plenty, animal carcasses often remained to open sight, untouched. This lack of hygiene reflected on the citizens and was also one of the main reasons for the rapid spread of the bubonic plague in the mid-1300s. Education in medieval society. Some children went to school to learn to read and write, but most didn't. Schools were expensive and usually located in towns. Children from wealthy families may have had a tutor or attended a grammar school, but the cost of schooling meant that most children couldn't afford to go. There were also schools in monasteries, but children were most often sent there to become monks. Instead of formal schooling, many medieval children learned how to farm, grow food, and tend to animals. Some also learned a trade and perhaps became an apprentice to a local craftsperson like a carpenter or a tailor. During the Middle Ages, military service was mandatory for all men, without question. So when the Lord called his banners, you had to answer. A peasant man would have little to gain from his military service unless plundering was allowed. It was the nobles who would increase his wealth. Of course, peasant soldiers were often used as a last measure or the rear line of support, while the actual skilled warfare was conducted by trained men, knights, cavalrymen, and foot soldiers. The medieval period was also a time of significant racial and religious discontent. Religion was by far the biggest driving force behind all major happenings in the era, and the source of all wars and suffering. From the earliest Middle Ages, Christianity spread like wildfire. It consumed the courts of Europe exclusively through political means. Kings accepted Christianity only to increase power and political influence. As the centuries progressed, pagan peoples were oppressed and forcefully converted. Free speech was non-existent in medieval Europe. And behind all of this was wealth. Wars, murders, massacres was all for that glint of gold. Everyone vied for more and more wealth, and they did it by using the poor classes for their own gain. Gold was highly valued and poisoned many a mind. the traditional way of life of the classical period was subdued by greed, wars, and riches. The Jews of Europe established merchant banks in major urban centers and introduced a system of usury, charging interest, and they would loan large sums of money to major rulers in Europe. When they began exploiting the common folk, they were often chased away. This system of loans lasts to this day, albeit on a bigger and more modern scale. But life in medieval Europe wasn't the same for everyone, even the nobles. Orthodox Christians, the Byzantines, influenced Eastern Europe in entirely different ways. Yes, the class differences were still there, and yes, greed and warfare was rampant, but lives were different. The Eastern Europe regions largely retained their old pastoral ways of life, and urban centers were next to none. Orthodoxy played an important role for the rulers who raised many monasteries, which became a sort of currency. Clergy were given more power and played an important role in political development, but only by the grace of kings. And still, the poor classes, the villagers, and the simple folk all suffered the same hardships that the rest of Europe did. So, how was life in medieval Europe? Would a modern-day man or woman survive a peasant's living state? Would this woman survive? Life in medieval Europe was nowhere near pleasant. Death lurked around every corner, and it had many foul forms, all unexpected and cruel. So, and much of us people wouldn't survive long in a society like that. So, the only thing that remains for all of us living in the comforts of the 21st century is to be thankful for what we have. No matter how little, it is 1,000 times more than our medieval ancestors. If you liked our video, don't forget to subscribe and follow our channel for more videos like this one.